Hola a toda la audiencia de Criptonoticias. Bienvenidos a Separando el Dinero del Estado, un podcast en el que hablamos e investigamos qué significa esto de separar el dinero del Estado. Nos encontramos aquí con Josef Tětek. Él es el líder de la Trezor Academy, la parte de educación de Trezor. Nos encontramos en el evento Trustless by Design, en el cual Trezor acaba de lanzar la Trezor 6.7, una nueva hardware wallet que por primera vez integra un chip de elemento seguro completamente de código abierto. Today the interview is going to be in English. And I wanted to talk with you, Josef, because you wrote this book, which is called, aside from your role in Trezor and all of that, I wanted to speak with you like you're an economist, right?
Yes.
As a thinker as well, as an author. You wrote this book called Separation of Money and State, which, as I told you before, it's also the name of this podcast. I believe it has been kind of a meme, but a powerful direction to strive towards, no?
Mm-hmm.
Like, probably the reason why we should have Bitcoin. But I don't want to talk anymore. I want to hear what you think. What is for you, why is it important to separate money and state, in your perspective?
That's a great question that everybody should be asking all the time, especially people in the countries where the fiat currencies don't work so well. So maybe to start in the broader terms, right now I believe we have around 180 currencies around the world, and all of these currencies are so-called fiat currencies, meaning they are not backed by anything tangible. It used to be gold and silver, and backed by, meaning you cannot redeem the currencies for the underlying metals like you were used to until, let's say, World War I in most of the countries around the world. So it used to be that gold and silver were money, and the states used to issue like special notes, sometimes coins, that were redeemable for the underlying money, for gold and silver, or even like the coinage itself was in gold and silver, but banknotes arrived as basically warehouse receipts. But then after World War I, most countries actually went off the gold and silver standard. You couldn't redeem the notes for anything anymore. And so we have been on this like fiat standard for the past, let's say, 100 years. In some countries like the US, it's since 1971. Switzerland went off the gold standard, I believe 1999. But usually these late gold standards were not redeemable for ordinary citizens anymore. And also like this past 100 years, we have seen an unprecedented amount of hyperinflations, of very persistent inflation rates that basically wiped out the whole economies. Like we've seen that in Argentina, we see that in Hungary, in Soviet Union, in Yugoslavia before it broke apart. We've seen it so many times. It's like dozens and dozens of instances of currencies falling apart, hyperinflation, people losing everything, a lot of times in their lives. And we see it until this day. There's, sure what's the precise number now, but maybe like 20 or 30 countries that have double-digit inflation, more than 10%. And a 10% inflation basically halves your purchasing power within 4 or 5 years. And we need to ask the question why this is the case over the past 100 years, why every single currency in the world loses its purchasing power over the years, some slower, some faster, but every single fiat currency does that the state is managing the currency. It's a centrally planned kind of phenomenon. And we have seen...
Do you think that's the main cause or the only cause?
I think it's basically the underlying cause. It's the only cause. That the state, sometimes through a semi-independent central bank, sometimes directly as a government, is managing the currency. And even if the central bank is independent, that it still follows an inflation targeting monetary. We see that everywhere in the world. Simply means that you cannot save in such currency. It may work as a medium of exchange to some extent, still not a lot of currencies actually do work like that if we're talking cross-border transactions, but it still may work to some extent as a medium of exchange. But no single currency in the world today works as a store of value. You simply cannot save in fiat currencies today.
So do you feel or do you think that fiat currencies and central management of currency has like eliminate the possibility for saving?
Yes, definitely. It used to be the case, let's say in 18th, 19th centuries, you could simply go to your job or sell your produce, manage your farm, let's say, sell your produce for silver coins, larger amounts for gold coins. You could just put that away at your home, so no counterparty risk. You wouldn't have to invest it, you wouldn't have to give it away to someone to manage it for you. And the purchasing power of those coins would simply rise over the longer terms because the productivity was on the rise back then. It's on the rise even today, but we don't see anymore this projection of the productivity rises into our purchasing power because as I said, the fiat currencies simply don't work like that because they are being issued at an increasing pace, whereas gold and silver, it's just not as easy to produce. There is still some production going on, but in the past, like the issuance of gold and silver metals were much lower than the productivity gains, which meant that you are able to increase your purchasing power over the long terms if you saved in this type of money. And that was quite a normal thing for ordinary people throughout history, that you could actually save in the money that you worked with. And that simply stopped to be since the onset of the fiat currencies.
And what implications does this, for the time perception of how does not having the ability to save for the future and having to spend your money does affect you like in a time administration
time preference. So the more certain you can be in the money that you use, that it actually evaporate, the so-called lower time preference you have, that's an economic term from economics, and it simply means that you plan for the longer terms, because if you put away one silver coin today, you know it will have the same purchasing power or slightly more in 10 years. So you can actually manage the big side of your life, of you and your family. You can save up for maybe for the school for the kids, and you don't have to stress too much about it. You don't have to find like investment opportunities. You don't have to worry about a bank going bankrupt because you keep it for yourself. You self-custody. Like self-custody was actually a normal thing back when there were gold and silver coins for ordinary people. Of course, if you had larger amounts of money, you get to use the bank. But yes, the time preference is very much affected by the nature of money that we use. So we see in countries where hyperinflation occurs that you cannot run any businesses, you cannot purchase stock for a couple of months, because you cannot simply plan anything, because you don't know what things are going to cost 1 week or 1 month from now, or even tomorrow, if it's really fierce hyperinflation. So the society basically breaks down completely, economically and societally as well. I recommend some good readings from the Weimar hyperinflation or the Zimbabwe hyperinflation. It's interesting that you can see that a lot of people basically partied because that's all that's left. You use the money as fast as you can for whatever you can, and there is no planning anymore. There's no economic calculation, basically. It totally destroys any means of economic calculation if the purchasing power evaporates like 50% per day.
Yeah. It happens to me once that I went to a bar and the second beer was expensier than the first one in Venezuela, and I experienced that in the time frame of half an hour or something like that. The currency in just that short amount of time, and it's
insane.
Yeah, I think in the price system, it's somehow like a coordination system, no? Like how can coordinate ourselves in this such short amount of time in which the system varies in only half an hour.
Yeah, to buy 2 beers at once and just get as drunk as possible, as swiftly as possible. Yeah, I've heard like
So that's a good metaphor, actually, because
the
society,
difference is much higher then.
no, and society gets drunker because of that. Because if you don't look forward for the future and you don't planify yourself, you don't have to restrict yourself, because immediacy becomes like your main thing.
Yeah. A society with a high inflation rates is very nihilistic. Basically, nothing matters. You cannot control things. Like the ordinary like phenomenons from the financial literacy kind of don't apply, because it just doesn't make sense for you to save if the currency is falling apart. And yeah, you have mentioned one good term, the coordination in the society. And I always like to recommend one specific article from Friedrich August von Hayek. It's called The Use of Knowledge in Society. And I think that's the best explanation on what the price systems do, what the mechanism is all about. And it's precisely about coordinating complex society so that it works in harmony, so that things actually work. You can deliver stuff to the markets, you can invest, and it's all beautifully managed by the prices. But the problem is if the price system doesn't work, because the money itself on which the prices run, if the money itself don't work, then the price system becomes very noisy, because instead of the price going up because something is more scarce or more demanded, as it should be, prices are going up because there is more supply of the currency itself in the system. So you have a lot of misallocation of capital. You have the business cycles where people, for some reason, go crazy and invest in some sectors of the economy, and then it falls apart. So we have like these booms and busts. And the Austrian economists like Friedrich Hayek or Mises explained why that is the case, why we have this business cycle, and it's precisely because of meddling with the price system through issuance of the currency, to 8-10% issuance of the currency per year, which is normal in the societies today. In Venezuela, it was of course much higher. Yeah, since we're on this topic, it's important for the listeners to understand that if you issue like 8% of the money into the system every single year, distributed equally in the system. So we don't see just a rise of the price level at one point, but we see it flows through the economy through some channels, usually through financial markets, through real estate markets. And that's why you have these investment bubbles. And why it might seem that it's a good idea to invest in the stock or the real estate, but you're actually just contributing to the bubble, and at some point it will simply collapse, like it did in 1929, during the Great Depression, like it did in 2009. During the previous financial crisis. And right now we're basically seeing asset bubbles everywhere, because there's so much money created in the past 10 years that there's just a bubble everywhere. There's a debt bubble as well. There's too much debt. And as I say in the book, there is no way out of the debt anymore. The US debt is more than 120% of GDP. And there is no way out of that besides just printing more money. So that contributes to the asset bubble and debt bubble. Yeah, I've been asking like fellow economists who are not on my train, like, what's the solution to that? Nobody has a good answer. There is no good answer to that, because if you get to these debt levels and to these asset bubble kind of levels, it either all totally deflates, so all the money basically goes out of the system, which is what happened in the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s, or you continue to inflate the bubble until there's runaway or hyperinflation. There's basically no other option.
So it's running forwards to collapse or backwards to collapse, but then there is no excavatory. You have mentioned several times like this explanation of the Great Depression. You find it in Murray Rothbard. You mentioned a lot of Mises and Hayek, and it feels like Austrian economist and the Austrian School of Economics has found a good match with the Bitcoin industry, to the point that sometimes for me feels like ideology. We are so sure of this that has been spoken by authors, economists, and thinkers. I fear that we don't give enough credit to think about other possibilities, even though that the Austrian School of Economics has been very niche throughout time, no, and has been even discredited by the traditional schools of economics, or at least the monetary theory or the Keynesianism, and which has been the dominant schools of economics in the last years. Why do you think why are the arguments against the Austrian School of Economics, and at the same time, is there a risk of kind of renouncing to our ability to think by yourself just by using the framework, the theoretical framework of the Austrian School of Economics?
Yeah, so there's many things to unpack here. So first of all, why the Austrian school isn't as popular as Keynesianism or other schools of economics. It has been explored quite a lot. Maybe, let's say, by the Mises Institute in the US. That's the main think tank, basically, for the Austrian school today. And part of the answer is that universities are a lot of times directly or indirectly supported by the state through grants, through licenses, charters. And the Austrian school is not very state-friendly, let's say. Not in a like political, philosophical way, but in a way that it is harsh measures, let's say, to the state. It says there is no free lunch. That's a very good saying by Milton Friedman. There ain't such thing as a free lunch. But the voters and the democratic system always promises and always are looking for the free lunch. So going into debt, lowering the interest rate so the debt is more manageable, more currency, and just putting it into the system when there's any crisis. And we have seen that since the ancient Roman times. Nero debased the currency because of the big fire in Rome. So you always can find a justification for why there's more debt needed, more inflation needed. Sounds convincing, but the Austrian school doesn't do compromises in that, because it always points out the second and third order effects, like the inflation rate, the loss of purchasing power over the long term, the business cycle, the asset bubbles, the debasement of the society, the increase in the time preferences, and eventual collapse. The other schools, other than the Austrian schools, are much more friendly to this idea that there are actually free lunches. And it's interesting that even Keynesianism, to some extent, does impose some restrictions on the state, but that uncomfortable part is being left. For example, Keynes himself, he said that during the booms, you should basically have balanced budgets or budget deficits. And you should use these budget surpluses. And you should use these surpluses during the bust part of the cycle. So even Keynes himself was looking to save for the future as well. Ignorant. But nobody today, even if they proclaim themselves Keynesian or following the Keynesian policy, actually manages to have budget surpluses. Almost all the states nowadays are in permanent deficits, budgetary deficits and I even believe the Chicago Monetary School also wasn't going for total persistent inflation rates at all costs. So the state or the establishment just picks what handy for them, so that the policy doesn't look totally made up. They need some justification in terms of, look, we are just following the best experts at our universities. And of course, the experts get the prestigious roles, get the tenures at the universities in return. And as I said, the universities and the establishment, the state is pretty much interconnected, directly or indirectly. One interesting example maybe of that is when I was studying at the University of Economics here in Prague, Czech Republic. There was one very special faculty that was basically run by Austrian economists, Czech guys, and Austrian economics in Czech Republic is still quite popular.
Okay.
It's not mainstream, but it's quite popular. We had all the main books translated into Czech. There's like influencers that talk about libertarianism and Austrian school. So there was this faculty run by the Austrian economists. I was very lucky to study like under these teachers and professors. I wrote my thesis on the private provision of public goods, which wouldn't be possible in like an ordinary mainstream school. But this faculty gradually was under increasing pressure to change the narrative, not to be like hostile and critical to the government, because of course it's the usual mainstream democratic government that wants to run deficits and stuff. And in the end, it just fell apart basically, and it was overtaken by the mainstream Keynesianism, Keynesian school of economics. So it lasted maybe for like 10 years, and it's a public university. I believe it's not a coincidence that this group of misfits was in the end ostracized, and they went to private universities here and there, but it just couldn't last at a public university like that. There's also like one thing we should distinguish: School of Economics, like the Austrian School of Economics, and then there's the political philosophy of libertarianism. As you said, like Austrian school can sometimes be perceived as an ideology, but that's mostly because if you follow the like insights of Austrian School of Economics, you become a libertarian. You become you subscribe to the political philosophy of libertarianism. But the Austrian school, as a school of economics, it's just an analytical tool to research and understand incentives in the how the price mechanism works, what is caused by monetary inflation, like the business cycle, and it should be value free. So which you basically shouldn't be able to say it's bad that there's like this persistent inflation, but you can say you are causing the capital misallocation, the increase in the inflation rates, in the misallocation of capital, in the time preference. And the political philosopher in you can have like the value judgments. And we have seen that with Mises or Rothbard, that they basically sat on two stools. They were economists on one side, value free, and then they were also political philosophers on the other side, making some value judgments. But these two roles should be separate. As a libertarian, you would usually use the Austrian school as your analytical tool and basically deduce like the value judgments from that. But we should be careful not to like
mix it, confuse
and that's why like people looking at us from outside think that like Bitcoin is a cult or it's an ideology or the Austrian school is an ideology, because they're not trained in thinking as an economist, and an economist isn't a political philosopher.
Okay. Interesting. I wanted to come back to the point you said about your thesis being the private provision of public goods, because I believe it's very related to our topic of separation of money and state, because with the separation of money and state, you actually take some of the financial tools the states have for provision of goods, which can be inflation, by example. It's the most silent tax, as Rothbard call it, and yeah, it like you increase the accountability of the state when you have taken away the possibility or the ability to inflate the. How do you foresee the provision of public goods in a country which has accomplished this goal of separating money and state?
Yeah. In economics, you can always find a precedent in history in terms of like how things would work. There's always this question: who would build the roads like libertarians get asked. And you can see many instances in history where roads were provided by private actors and were paid for on voluntary means. What I described sort of in my thesis. You don't have to really like
reinvent the wheel.
Reinvent it, yeah. So in England, in medieval England, toll roads were quite common, and You can research like what were the if there's like a good needed, there are incentives to find a way to provide the good and to be paid for. So one practical example of the private provision of public goods, it's very famous in economics, is the lighthouses. Ronald Coase described that problem in depth, because I don't know who was it, but somebody said that a lighthouse is a perfect example of public good, because you cannot exclude anybody from the good that it provides, and you cannot get anybody to pay for it, basically, because they just sail by. And Ronald Coase thought that's weird, because he was just that it shouldn't be like that. So he actually sat down and researched how it worked in history, and he found out in the medieval England it was common for private companies to build lighthouses, and the way they did it is you actually pay the fee for the lighthouse when you put it in the port, when you paid for the services of the local port. So the lighthouse keepers, they had an agreement with the port managers and the port owners, so that they would collect the fees for them. So that's how you actually do it if there is a good, it feels like a pretty good, because you cannot exclude anybody from it, like the roads, let's say, even though roads are pretty easy because you just put in the tolls, maybe like public parks, public lighting, public safety and stuff, because you just attach the payment for these goods to some other goods that are collectible, like a rent payment. And we see around the world already there's like gated communities, there's private communities, there's even private towns, charter cities as well. Developments like Prospera, which are quite run to some extent on these principles. So it's not sci-fi, like saying you can privately provide the public goods, because it's just you just don't have the imagination and you don't have the historical context if you're saying that it's impossible to provide some goods that are actually wanted in the market. So I just say research history, research economic history, because all the answers are basically there.
Do you foresee that the separation of money and state will lead to the future eradication of state as a political organization?
Maybe not, but it will be very diminished in its role. I mean, there's always this big discussion in between minarchism and anarchism. To a great extent, it's meaningless. If you get to like 1% of the size of the state towards what we have now, then the last 1% don't even matter anymore. So maybe in some societies there is some role for the state, but the state, maybe it's what I've probably happen is the breakup of these large super states like the United States or Russia and China. The United States shouldn't be like one single state, it should be 50 individual states, and the federal government has grown to such an enormous extent, largely thanks to fiat currency and to the inflation tax. So what I see happening, sound money system like the Bitcoin standard, is the states getting much smaller, the power getting much closer to the people. Because right now, if you're living in Oregon or Alabama, it's very hard for you to change what's happening in the DC.
Yeah, definitely.
The same in Europe. If I'm living in Prague, the European Commission, that's so distant from us, and they just make up these stupid rules all the time, and there's basically nothing we can do about it. Whereas if you go being single individual states, I think things would be much more sane, much more peacefully than if you have these huge, enormous super states thinking they are the kings of the world, and it's so distant from the people. And if they have the inflation tax, they don't even have to directly tax the people, they don't have to explain themselves. So what would probably happen in the sound money standard would be many more states, maybe even back to the city states, which I think was a very good way to run things.
I ask this because of theoretically the main reason we have this state organization, which is the monopoly of violence and the administration of the management of how we deal with the reality of violence, because it's a reality. There is violence in the world. So if we privatize this kind of public goods, what do we do with the administration of violence? I remember from your book, Oppenheimer, this history of how the state was formed. And Oppenheimer or you said that it was the tough guys which came and wanted to steal the farmers, the herdsmen, trying to steal from the farmer, found out like, hey, this is good business. We should stop being nomadic and we should settle with the farmers, provide them security. No, so security is the business, the original business of the state. How do we deal with it?
That's a good one. Just for the listeners, we're talking about Franz Oppenheimer, the German sociologist, not the father of the atomic bomb. That's more for us. It's a nice precision. Also a question that has been explored to a great extent by the Austrian economists who would provide the security, basically. Rothbard talks about insurance agencies that would make sure that things are safe, because if not, they would have to pay out the insurance. So it's very much tied to probably like dependent, privately provided city regions or cities itself, where you would have like competing insurance agencies. That is maybe a little bit on the side of making it up, because that hasn't been the case in history. What is probably closest to what would happen is some sort of feudalism, because feudalism based on aristocratic structures where each level was to a large extent independent. That wasn't strictly a straight state structure. It was a little bit more emergent than like the top-down systems now, especially like the legal arrangements in these systems used to be common law, and other types, variations of common law under feudalism. So to a listener today, it's like feudalism, that's just Middle Ages, everybody is oppressed. But the tax rates were actually much lower than they are today in this system. And the accountability of the aristocracy was quite high, especially in the common law system. So again, I think we can look to the history, to how and like an emergent aristocracy worked. Hans Hermann Hoppe is a very good for exploring these. It's Alexander Svetski. He wrote the Bushido of Bitcoin, where he looks at like Japanese and European medieval times and how things work. I don't have like a precise answer. What I usually recommend to people is like good authors to think about it for yourself with the author that you're reading. So Hoppe, Hans Hermann Hoppe, I think is one of the best on that. What is, I think, important for people to understand if you're considering like anarcho-capitalism is it doesn't mean there is authority or there are no rules. It just means the authorities and the rules are not imposed arbitrarily by people that have no accountability, no feedback, which is the state that we are at right now. But if you don't have this inflation tax, maybe if you don't even have the legitimacy of like the democratic government, let's say, because more people basically, or because the democracies collapsed, let's say, then some other structures would emerge. And us libertarians would argue that these structures would be more just, prosperous. But not to be naive about that, communism, various types of fascism are still very popular in the societies today. So even if European Union, for example, breaks apart, there will be like communist countries. I try not to be about it. But what happens with sound money systems and with the evaporation of legitimacy of the systems that we have today is there is a vacuum that needs to be filled, and it will be filled at some point. And the question then is how the incentives are structured, whether what comes in will be another Mao, another communist dictator, or another, I don't know, there's not very good examples of enlightened leaders, but maybe to some extent Milei or somebody who at least nominally understands how the incentives work. And Bitcoin basically takes power away from the communists and socialists today. If the fiat currencies fall apart and the legitimacy falls apart, then things like communism won't be able to hold together for long.
And now that you mentioned Bitcoin, which this is a Bitcoin podcast and we haven't mentioned Bitcoin that much, with all these nation-state adoption, and also you mentioned in your book that you quote a reference to the Executive Order 6102, in which they seize the gold from citizens. And we know for most of the Bitcoin that the states already have has been seized, that has been their main adoption gateway.
Yeah.
No? Do you foresee or do you think it's riskful to that Bitcoin project, the separation of money and state project, it's somehow compromised by the risk of states seizing the Bitcoin from their citizens?
No, I don't think so, because Bitcoin isn't a proof of stake, so it doesn't really matter who holds what amount of Bitcoin. But I do believe like individual Bitcoiners are at risk if they don't take self-custody and privacy seriously. I do think big exchanges like Coinbase might be at some point subject to something like Executive Order 6102, so confiscated in the name of national stability, and there will always be some excuse. And it's very easy for the governments to confiscate Bitcoin from these large custodians. Might not happen maybe in the US, may happen in other countries, but I guess it will happen to some extent in the US and Europe as well. Probably not through 100% confiscation, but through some specific tax imposed on Bitcoin gains or Bitcoin holdings. There's a lot of talk about unrealized capital gains tax in both the EU and US. And with the debts out of control, this is going to be quite real quite soon, I would say. So it might be a case that if you hold Bitcoin on Coinbase, you will be subject to like 2% tax every year, and that is a confiscation. You should be, as an individual holder, you should be holding your own keys, and ideally trying to find ways to obtain Bitcoin without KYC. We have a very nice Czech project, Vexel, and there are like independent communities around the world where you can just exchange cash for Bitcoin, and I believe that is the way. But Bitcoin as such won't be at risk by governments confiscating Bitcoin. If anything, I think it will even increase like the legitimacy of Bitcoin, because then it means that it is very valuable even for the governments to hold.
Okay. And how do you foresee this separation of nations, of state and money unfolding? I mean, do you see a gradual process in which the adoption will just promote Gresham law and something like that? Or how is this unfolding?
Yes, as Parker Lewis says, gradually then suddenly.
Okay.
That's how it happens. So we are definitely in the gradually phase, and we can see a lot of people over the years have said, what if the government bans Bitcoin? And we see the very opposite. We see the governments accepting spot ETFs in the US. We see the large banks starting to offer Bitcoin products to their clients. So, and also governments like the Salvadoran one making Bitcoin legal tender. The Trump, whatever we think of him, he is much more pro-Bitcoin than any other president before. I'm very happy he let Ross free finally. That's a different topic. What was the precise question?
How do we achieve the separation?
Yeah, how do we achieve it? So yeah, so we are in the gradual phase. Bitcoin is getting legitimacy at an increasing pace. But for the Western societies, it's going to be much slower paced adoption than, for example, for the African ones. Because, as I said, there's basically two functions of money, medium of exchange and store of value. And in Africa, money doesn't work at both accounts, basically. It doesn't work as a store of value at all because you have very high inflations, up to hyperinflations, and it doesn't really work as a medium of exchange because there's a lot of people unbanked. There is almost no possibility to do cross-border transfers. So we already see Bitcoin being adopted at a large pace in various African communities like South Africa, Bitcoin Caso, and you are able to pay at thousands of merchants already in South Africa because it fulfills a very needed role of actual usable money. I believe the Bitcoin adoption will happen first in the global South on the large societal level. Maybe the nation, not the national level, not the government level. They will still try to protect their own monopoly, but the people of these countries will adopt Bitcoin as a savings technology and as a medium exchange.
Well, let's hope it unfolds that way, very peacefully and very gradually and then suddenly, as you said.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Josef. It was pretty interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.